Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Standardizing Data Across Counties, our workshop. My name is Krista Brown, and I'm the APS Leaders Institute Program Coordinator for APS Workforce Innovations, also known as APSWI, and I will be moderating this virtual training today with tech support from Rabaz Taha, our Training Operations Coordinator and Tech Support Person Extraordinaire. I'd also at this time like to welcome our esteemed presenters today, and then we'll go into some housekeeping and get started. Very much want to welcome Natasha Nikolai, who is the Chief Data Strategist, Director of Research, Automation, and Data Division with CDSS. And in that role, Natasha partners with key CDSS service delivery divisions to define strategic data collection, governance, and consumption goals and collaborative systems to optimize, automate, and share data analytic and research opportunities to improve service delivery and program outcomes. Natasha and her team strategically partner with other state departments, California Health and Human Service Agency execs, county government leadership, and advocate stakeholders to ensure smooth organizational change, maximize data sharing opportunities, and improve technology solutions for modern data intake and integration processes. And prior to this position, Natasha was Chief of CalWorks and Family Resilience. I'd also like to welcome Chris O'Leary, who probably does not need any introduction, but I'll do it anyway. So Chris is Program Manager with APS, ST, and Specialized Case Management. With Aging and Independent Services, County of San Diego Health and Human Service Agencies. Ms. O'Leary has worked in APS for 21 years, with the last 9 years as Program Manager. And prior to APS, Chris worked in the field of domestic violence with the military, the Long-Term Care Ombudsman, and Aging and Independent Services call centers. She's also the current outgoing chair of CWDA's PSOC, Protective Services Operations Committee, where she has been part of the committee work to implement namers in California and worked on development of the last 2 APS and county services block grant monthly statistical reports, also known as SOC 242 lovingly. She has been a consultant to CDSS in the implementation of the most recent SOC 242 that went live in January 2019. And also does not need a introduction, but I will. Lori Delagrammaticus, Executive Director of NAPSA. And prior to going to NAPSA, Lori was the governor-appointed APS liaison to the counties with CDSS. And prior to that, she worked 8 years with what was known as Master Program at the Academy for Professional Excellence, where she worked on core curriculum and training. And Lori is the recipient of the NAPSA Collaboration Award and NAPSA 2016 Distinguished Service Award. So really, really happy to have our presenters today who are bona fide data nerds. So let's just put it out there. And before we begin, I'd like to just go through some basics. We will be recording the presentation portion of this workshop today to make available to registrants who couldn't join us. And also, if you haven't done so already, if you could type your name, title, county, and what you are hoping to take away from this workshop, that would be really helpful. As we have discussed before, APSWI is part of the Academy for Professional Excellence, a project of San Diego State University School of Social Work. And APSWI specifically provides innovative workforce development to APS professionals and their partners. And the Academy as a whole provides workforce development and learning experiences to health and human services professionals. And the Academy programs are there on the right. We are trying something a little different to create a safe and welcoming learning environment. So across APS programs, we are presenting group agreements to folks. So we are going to endeavor today to default to inquiry rather than to defensiveness, practice non-judgmental and respectful interactions, practice self-awareness with attention to impact on oneself and others, and contribute to a supportive, strength-focused learning environment. So we are going to do that as a group today, and we hope that that works for you. And then Zoom, we are all very familiar with Zoom, and we will be using it for interaction. We'd love to hear from you, but when you're not speaking, please go ahead and mute yourself. We'd love to see you, and please turn your camera on if you're able. We will be going into breakout groups. Also awesome to turn your camera on so you can see your colleagues. We're using chat. Hopefully you have that open. We've already been using chat. Please feel free to pose questions as our presenters are presenting. Give us a BRB, be right back if you need to step away. It really helps with the small group breakout assignments, and then just give us a I'm back when you come back. Feel free to use the reactions or emoticons, thumbs up, raising hands, all that good stuff. We will keep track of that. And then today we have a pretty full day. We are together from 9 to 11. We encourage you to stay for the duration of that. We did have a pre-work e-learning assignment that we had sent out and sent some reminders. Totally understandable if you were not able to complete it. You may have started it, but not have completed it. You may have not have started it yet. That's not a problem. You will still be able to participate in the breakout group. But we are hoping that by the time we have our June 2nd booster, you are able to go ahead and complete that. And Chris will talk a little bit more about her thoughts around the usefulness of this e-learning. I think it's fabulous. I learned a lot. It's very engaging and fun. So check it out. The other thing is we do have some participant materials that we had sent out yesterday to you all. Verbaz has put a link in the chat box. They have the slides minus Natasha's slides, which we'll send out after the training. And they also have the link to the SOC 242 form, a cool demographic categories handout from the e-learning, and the FAQ, SOC 242 FAQ. So please have that available and open. We will be hearing from Lori, then Natasha and Chris, and then we will go into our breakout groups to discuss the 242 data elements and come back to process next steps and talk about our booster on June 2nd. And then of course, our evaluation at the end. Okay, learning goals for today, and then I'll hand it on over. So we are going to be looking at a few benefits of accurate data collection. We're going to describe how data is used at the federal, state, and county levels for APS. Identify one way as an APS manager or whatever your role is to use data at the county level to make a difference in your program, and review the SOC 242 and identify one data element to use for education, advocacy, and I'll add program improvement. Okay, so any questions about that, please pose in the chat box, and I'm going to hand it on over to Lori to talk about namers.
All right, well, thank you guys for having me. I was asked to sort of let you know how this works at the national level. Nationally, the Administration for Community Living has asked each state to provide standardized data elements about their APS programs to the feds. And that data comes in 3 levels. One is the administrative level, which if a state just does administrative, they say, how do they define APS? Who are their clients? And what kinds of abuse do they investigate? That's kind of it at the administrative level. Then they also collect data at the key component data, and that's aggregate data about their program and their clients. So when I say aggregate, it's how many 93-year-old women do you see, for example, would be a key component. How many reports of financial abuse do you get are key components. There are a number of states, I think we're getting close to 20, that have statewide case management systems that are able to provide case level data, which is data that for each case, now they don't give out names, of course, that's hooked together. So how many 92-year-old women have been financially abused? They can hook those data elements together. So California does not do that at this point. We collect in the SOC 242 the key indicator data. That's what the change that was made a couple years ago to update the SOC 242 did for California is it expanded the number of key indicator data, key components that we collected. So one of the big issues right now in talking to the feds about elder abuse and abuse of persons with disability data nationally is every state has different definitions, different structures, collects different data, because you don't have to collect every one of the data elements they're asking for in NAMERS. You might only be able to collect a portion of them. So what NAMERS can do right now is provide side-by-side comparisons between states. The other thing you should know about NAMERS is currently NAMERS will not give out state-specific data. They will only give out aggregate data. So they recently have done some listening sessions at the NAPSA conference and by webinar to find out what else they need to be collecting. And NAMERS is going to be updated soon. And as part of that update, they are actually going to ask states whether they can give out information and under what circumstances. So hopefully that will expand that, because once that's expanded to know which states are which, it's going to help researchers and it's going to help legislators. Because as you can see in our primary bullet number 2, data equals dollars. NAPSA gets asked all the time, how much abuse is out there? And our answer is, we don't really know, because all the states are different and they collect data different. The sooner we can actually give really strong data to legislators showing them the size of the problem, the sooner we are going to get more funding. You know that on your county level, that if you can show that the number of reports is increasing or that the cases are more complex, you can go to your board of supervisors and make a case for more staff or more funding. At the national level, we also need good data to get you the federal funding we're looking for. With federal funding, and I say this in tons of meetings, with federal funding will come federal guidelines, which we may or may not love, but it will bring consistency and will help us get to this data that we can use to get money. Does that make sense for everybody? Michael's clapping. Thank you, Michael. We put a link here for you to go and look at the NAMERS reporting system and what you can pull out of that. And you can use their aggregate numbers nationally to compare to what's happening in your county if you'd like, in order to show, you know, we've got a bigger problem here in this county than we're seeing nationally. So that's my big contribution today. Data equals dollars, guys. We got to get good data and you got to know how to use it. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Lori. All right, so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to hand it on over to Natasha. So I have stopped sharing, Natasha.
I like this view where we can see everybody. Wow.
I know, isn't it nice? It's like the Brady Bunch expanded.
The wrong direction they've been on.
Great.
Okay, confirming we're on the right slide, yeah?
Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Good morning, everyone. I'm Natasha. Thanks for the introduction, Krista, and thanks everyone for inviting me to chat with you this morning. As noted, I have, just a few things I'm working on at the department right now in terms of data and research. To give you a tiny bit more context about how I arrived here, I'll just start by saying I came to this work actually from a completely different career. So I actually started out in medicine, and much more like the work that you all do, I started out working with individuals one-on-one. I was an orthopedic specialist, I worked in rehab, and was really focused on patient care. That said, while I was in that field, I was realizing very quickly that a lot of people in medicine don't practice medicine using the most recent evidence and research and data. Now, that might be surprising to you, and hopefully it's alarming to you, like it was alarming to me. And makes you think, why? I wonder why people do that, and sort of how did anecdote get to hold such a strong place in how we all behave? And as I explored that more, I got more interested in public policy and in kind of the higher level systems thinking about how it is that we engage with each other, and in particular in key areas like adult protective services, like poverty reduction, like medicine. Why is it that we're not more data driven? Why is it that the evidence that's out there is not being consumed, leveraged, and used to make better decisions? And so about 10 years into my career there, I switched and went into public policy, got a second graduate degree, and landed in poverty reduction work. So as noted, I was the TANF director for the state of California for a little over a year before I stepped into my current role. But even before that, I spent 5 years researching all across the country, a number of different social services programs, but with a huge emphasis on the TANF program here in the state of California. And it was through that work that I recognized and realized all over again just how difficult it is to infuse data into decision-making, and especially in the government, right? Government programs are designed to be transactional. They're designed oftentimes to be administrative. And they don't necessarily always focus on the outcomes that we all actually care about. So it was this fascinating experience and sort of a reboot for me where I thought, oh boy, this is a little bit like Groundhog's Day for me. Let me focus on that thing that's a through line to both of my career trajectories. And so that's how I ended up in this role that I'm in now, Chief Data Strategist. I was the first one named for the state. I think there are now a handful of us. I've been in this role for about 1.5 years. And really what the director and I were working together on in terms of establishing this role and establishing this work at CDSS is a lot of what Lori just highlighted, actually. Sort of the data matters, it matters for money, it matters for allocation, but I hope to tell you today why it matters for a whole host of reasons that should feel important to you. And let me just say right away that the second that Krista called me a wonk, one, I agreed, but two, you might have become fearful. You might have said, oh shit, I don't want to listen to this person talk for the next hour. I don't do data, right? I do people. And so let me just say how you might experience data today is that data is scary, or you work with people, not data, and that you think maybe data collection distracts you from your quote real work. Well, let's see if we can break that down a little bit, and let's see if we can have a conversation a little bit later to help us to figure out how it is, in fact, that data can influence your work and maybe should influence your work. So hopefully we can have a robust discussion today. Hopefully this can feel like a back and forth. You'll catch on quickly that I get pretty impassioned when I start talking about data, but please stop me if I'm losing you, stop me if I'm talking too fast, or if you feel like I'm not saying things that are pertinent to you. Just lost my screen. Are we still seeing the right thing? No.
So we're out of presentation mode. Look like you popped out a slideshow. There we go. We're back.
I'm trying to figure out how to pull up the chat. I want to be able to see what you all are saying.
And I can take I'll keep an eye on the chat for you.
Oh, thank you. That would be super helpful.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. And you'd think we would all be super experts at this point, but it's like some kind of guarantee that the second you're presenting, you forget how Zoom works. Okay, here we go. Okay, so data isn't scary. Let me start here. This is my favorite part. We all use data all the time. And if you don't believe me, we needn't look any further than 2 examples that I can almost guarantee you have been a part of your life in the last 24 hours. Let's start here. How many of you set your alarm earlier than you needed to wake up today? I know I did. I set my alarm 8 minutes exactly before I actually needed to get out of bed, because that's how long I know that my single snooze is set for. Now, what you don't realize is that you made that decision based on a series of experiences and data that you've been consuming for likely years in your life. Now, you might not have created a chart like this that said, how many times did I snooze and did I get to my job on time or did I get out of bed when I wanted to? But your mind is doing this. You did this. And you might not know that your average snooze is actually 2 times and that you're on time 83% of the time as long as you set your alarm appropriately. But you're doing this. You did this today. You did it yesterday. You likely have been doing this for the last few decades of your life to get yourself to work on time. In addition, let's think about this one. Now, how many of you have driven the freeway in the last week, day, 2 days to get to work or to go visit family? Probably most of us, right? Now, what you also don't know is that what you've done in your mind is created a probability density curve. Let me say more about what that means. We know that when you're choosing a speed on the freeway, that there's a whole range of options, right? You can go just under the speed limit, you can go right at the speed limit, and you also know sort of what other people are doing around you, generally, by experience, by tracking. You know that grandma and grandpa are driving over here, right? You know that most people are driving right around here. You know the cops don't care until you're probably going at least this fast, and so you made the choice to drive somewhere around here, right? This is the kind of thing that we just naturally do. We're all consuming these experiences and this data all the time, and it's informing the choices that you make, and it should. So let me see if we can't draw some parallels to the work that you're doing and why it matters just as much. Oh, I love these. Before we do that, I might even just say that sometimes we enjoy consuming data. It can be fun. It can be interesting. There are ways that we can put data out there that make it easier for people to consume and that draw people in, right? Here's a fun one about who wrote the most of the Beatles songs. Here's a classic one that shows us an interesting way of looking at world population. And right away, it jumps out that we might not always register the density of people in different areas across the world and how critical that is to understanding our relationships and the consumption in those areas. Classic one here around intergenerational mobility and the fact that the higher educated your parents were, the more likely you are to succeed, and some of the disproportionalities that we see in social services and that people experience intergenerationally at home. Here's another one that goes to show you about a year ago, all of the various investments that social services had made in partnership with the governor to try to disrupt poverty in the state of California. So all of these are good demonstrations of what we can do with data, how we drive compelling data narratives, how we help people to understand what it is that we do and why it's important. Next, I work with people, not with data. Well, let me just remind you that in government work, oftentimes the data are the people, right? Part of my job at the state of California is to reimagine what's possible with data and to help drive high quality, data-driven policy decisions that are human-centered. Well, the only way that I can do that is by observing all of the work that you do. Now, of course, I can't come sit with you in your office every day and see it, right? So the way that I consume your interactions with people is through the data oftentimes, right? So the data represent the people in this case. And what we want to avoid is data for the sake of data, right? And we want to be very thoughtful and careful that we're respecting and sort of abiding by security rules to protect both the people and their data. Using that data has to be a value add. That's my job, right? My job is to figure out how to work with you and this data and make sure that it's truly a value add. But in order to do all of that, there must be an accurate representation of both the client and the worker experience in that data. That consistency, that reliability is super critical if I'm going to help do these other things around being a value add and avoiding data for the sake of data, right? Taxpayers and people that we're serving the state of California have put their trust in us that we're serving them to the best of our ability. Much like when people go to the doctor, as I was mentioning earlier, we're trusting that that doctor is doing right by us, that they're doing the best thing that they possibly can. That's also our job here, right? Is to be respectful and to sort of take that trust that the people are giving us and use it wisely. Lastly, I'll say, quote, our real work, right? Data doesn't have to be a distraction from your real work, because our real work is being whole person and whole family centered, right? So a big piece of what we're trying to do is recognize that clients are experiencing our programs in a whole host of different ways, right? From birth to housing, to education, to getting help, and to having their needs met as they age, right? My job is to understand that most families, when they're experiencing or touching a social services, aren't just touching one. And yet we often have thought about them in these silos, right? As Lori was sort of alluding to, the state of California historically has looked at a lot of program data independent of the other programs. Now that's problematic when it comes to understanding how that whole family or that whole person approach is working. And when we make policy decisions in one program, we need to understand if it's impacting another program. The more high quality the data that comes in, the more I can take and sort of think about how to smooth someone's experience over their lifespan within CDSS, how I can help to make policy decisions and drive those decisions around that whole family focus, right? There are lots of layers and entry points and touch points that people in social services experience, and I should be able to help all of you to understand how those pieces fit together, to have a compelling narrative to legislators, to help get you those dollars, as Lori was saying, right? Data equals dollars. Lastly, I'll just say that within social services, right, there's this whole range of ways that we think about data, from policy change to implementation to the client experience, and it happens in a cycle, right? So at any point in time, I'm consistently looking at some aspect of how policy change has led to client experience and everything in between. And we have to understand something from the data about how each of these pieces are going, or we won't meaningfully know what levers to pull to improve our programs, to drive those narratives, to get you those dollars, because we won't always know sort of what's impactful, what's happening, how's it helping. And so we want to think about this lifespan together. And here at CDSS, part of my job has been to help take individuals who are working with your data and improve that narrative, right? And so we think a lot about so these are the folks that are supporting you up at the state level, that are working with Director Rutledge and myself to actually make meaning of your data. And so we want to support them. We want to support you in driving these data narratives and in making sort of ideal decisions. Now, adult programs, let's just get right into it here. So let's all recognize together a handful of things that are critical to making sure that we know sort of the sandbox, the landscape that we're working in, right? California has high rates of poverty, and we have a lot of disproportionality. We have barriers, discrimination, high levels of stress, and really vulnerable Californians deserve the quality support that we are providing to them. And we have to be able to say and know that I know I'm doing my job because the data, I know I'm doing my job well because the data tells me so. Californians deserve that. Program design matters, and many decades of research have provided insights into how to optimize human interactions to improve outcomes for both kids and adults. And lastly, collaboration and partnership. My work with you matters, and it should be informed by data and lead to innovations that fundamentally change how we deliver services for the better. Done well, data can demonstrate quality, consistency. It can help us establish milestones, drive impact, figure out when there's outliers. Where's that anecdote? What's real and what's an outlier? Good data can show disproportionality. It can help us to see improvement. It can help us to identify gaps. It sort of highlights the co-occurrences and things that are happening in context. It helps us to drive our priorities. And for APS, I think this data is super critical for transparency, again, that accountability of the public, to have actionable insights, to be human-centered and data-driven, to create an allocation framework. Again, data equals dollars, right? These are the models that drive the money to you. If we don't understand what you're doing, we can't effectively get those dollars to you. And it helps us to see equity, access, and safety, and hopefully outcomes, commitment, and those compelling data narratives. So how do we decide what's meaningful? Well, obviously, someone at the national level and at the state level has decided that. That's why we have the SOC 242. But let me just encourage you right now and say that doesn't have to be the end of the road. Part of my job is to help keep thinking and innovating and collaborating with all of you and with Kim Rutledge to think through what it is that we need to know to make these kinds of decisions, what it is that you need to know to feel like your data narrative is compelling and that you understand how your program is impacting the people that you're actually in this job to serve. So let me give you an example from CalWorks. This is how I thought about this when I was helping transform the TANF program for the state of California. There are all of these things that we call program theory, kind of the story behind the story, the black box of why does my program work, right? And in CalWorks or TANF nationwide, this is social welfare, so this is cash aid to families with kids. And there was this idea that people should just want to come in. People, of course, if they need cash, they know the rules, they're gonna come in, they're gonna engage with me, and in a transactional relationship, I'm gonna give them the dollars and they're just gonna keep coming in. Well, of course, we know that's not how humans work. Also, that's not a very compelling program in terms of engagement, right? We know that humans like interaction, they want relationships, they want to feel heard and seen, they want to be met where they're at. And so what we did was try to kind of turn that narrative on its head in CalWorks and really provide a more meaningful program theory and figure out then how could we drive that narrative through the data. So one, effective engagement. Imagine that. People want to be engaged in a meaningful way, setting meaningful goals. Imagine that. People don't want to just be told what to do. They don't want to come in and you're going to tell them, you have to get a job, you have to work 20 hours a week, that's it, that's your goal. They have other goals and alternative things that motivate them, and we should probably pay attention to them if we want to have meaningful engagement. Executive function and self-regulation matter. So we know from a ton of brain research and a ton of developmental research that building these executive function and self-regulation skills are absolutely critical to resilience and to future success. We know that people want positive and supportive relationships and that those things are key to developing executive function and so on and so forth. And so what we had to do was really understand, is my narrative around my program theory compelling? Is it compelling enough to say that I have cash, thus people will want to engage with me? And the answer was no. So we had to dig in and say, well, then what is my theory? Why do I believe my program will work? And so that led us to sort of imagine how outcomes drive program logic. So in the CalWorks program in TANF, federally, there's one single measure that's noted in terms of deciding whether your program is effective. It's called WPR. It's called the work participation rate. And so what that meant was that counties were only ever focused on one single output. That was hours. How many hours is someone participating in the workforce? And what that meant was when it came to engaging clients, they only cared about one thing. That was, are they participating in a federally defined work activity, right? Now, as you can imagine, based on the conversation that we just had 10 seconds ago, that's not compelling. That's not how people experience programs, and that's not how workers want to deliver their services. So we had to kind of flip that script too, right? We had to say, okay, well, what are the outcomes that we're actually interested in seeing? Well, it turned out that what we thought we were doing or what we wanted to do was help clients develop skills, to get them into job placements that matter to them, to help them retain those jobs, to build resilience in those families. Well, guess what? If those are the outcomes you're interested in, then the outputs that you need to be paying attention to are super different than just how many hours is someone participating in work, right? It means you need to look at engagement and a goal achievement and progress and education. And so that meant that we were really changing the way that we were asking counties to deliver activities, right? So to get to that, what we had to do was figure out what were our priorities, right? How do we connect those things to design and data sources? How do we focus on those outcomes that matter? And how can I drive those policy narratives then that the program can actually impact? We looked at what was quantitative, timely, actionable, standard, what could people actually understand? And what we did was created a completely different than kind of theory of change and way of examining the data. Now, here's the good news. If that sounded compelling to you, I hope it did. Get a thumbs up somewhere. The good news is nationally, it was also compelling. This is now the gold standard for how we think about measuring TANF programs nationwide. So the feds at ACF, they picked this up, they started paying attention, they said, oh, that actually makes quite a bit of sense. So the good news is logical people can work together and we can change these narratives. We can change the narratives at the state, we can change the narratives nationally, if we can just think through what it is that we're trying to accomplish and how the data can help us to tell that story. Now, let's bring it down to you. APS theory. So I think what we want to do here today now for the next maybe 25, 30 minutes together is think about how to apply some of these ideas to you. So I'm going to start with the first activity here, which is really about what's the program theory for APS? What's the program theory? How do you know that you're being effective in your work. Let's have a conversation about this first. Then I'm going to break us out into some breakout rooms to think through a logic model that applies to APS. Then we'll come back together. And then I want to think a little bit about context with you. Sound okay? Great. Okay. So first off, let's just open up the chat and let's have some conversations here around what your program theory of change is, right? I think it's safe to say that we all know that if we can't identify this, then it's going to be really hard for us to think about what data is going to matter. So I've pulled up my chat here. Okay, so what do we know to be true about aging, health, and safety in California? We can just start throwing some things in the chat. Perfect. Exactly, Lori. That's exactly right. Aging increases vulnerability. We all experience aging. I love it. The elderly population is growing. Absolutely true. Requires long-term case management if we want to make the change. I love that one. That's super important. There's an arc here to the experience and someone's engagement with the data and with our system. People are healthier when they're safe. Thanks, Kim. That's great. We all age and decline physically and cognitively. Exactly. People are aging and living longer. Perfect. Okay. So we've started to create a framework about what we know to be true, right? This is how this program came to be. This is why this program exists. Okay, so now let's think next then about the logical step down. Why do we think that APS services are necessary? Well, that one's a little bit easier to answer because we all just demonstrated what we know to be true, right? People are aging, that aging population is growing. It's going to happen to all of us. And with that aging comes cognitive decline occasionally and higher risks to our health and safety. Okay, so then the next most important, how do we know that APS dollars are having the greatest possible impact? Right, so let's assume that we've all jumped into this together because we know those facts to be true about aging. We think APS services are necessary to meet those needs. Now, how do we know? How do we know that we're having the greatest possible impact? Throw some ideas in the chat. Good, lower recidivism. Outcomes for seniors are improved. Outcomes, data, thanks, Gail. Thanks, appreciate the smiley face. Okay, so reduced recidivism is a very popular one here. Understanding how needs are being met specific to things like housing, I'm assuming specific to things like healthcare access, financial stability. Outcomes for seniors are improved. Okay, this is great. So now what we need to think about is how can we sort of collect data to know that? Good, when people are housed and their health issues are met, good, success stories, great. That they're aging longer in place, that they're staying safe in place. Okay, perfect. You get A++ for everyone, not only for engaging, but for having great answers. Now, if that exercise felt really obvious to you, let me just assure you, it's not always obvious to everyone. So what this tells me is I have a great group of super thoughtful people who are certainly engaged with logic and understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish. This will help us when it comes to what do we do with the data next. So let's jump in here. Okay. So here's what we created for CalWorks. We call this a logic model. So going back to that example I was just describing around cash aid and outcomes, right? So what we had to do then was figure out how to take those outcomes of interest and plug them into a policy framework that we actually had control over. That was something that I, as the TANF director, could actually have an impact on for the state of California. So we were looking at things like persistent employment, improved well-being, and what all of that meant in the shortest term was that we needed people to engage. Remember how I started with that engagement concept? It was because that was the #1 problem we were seeing in TANF from the data. People would come in for their first appointment, and then we would see about a 60% drop off with people coming in for their second appointment. Yikes, right? That's a huge problem. If people aren't engaged, how can I provide them services? If people aren't engaged, how can I help them get to these long-term outcomes that we all think are so meaningful? And so we had to kind of start at the beginning and say, intentional participation and engagement is super important. Building partnerships and collaborating, super important. Only when we've accomplished those short-term things, increasing activity attendance, increased participation and satisfaction, can we get to the medium-term outcomes of, say, improved well-being, goal achievement. barrier mitigation, right? In order to get to those long-term things. There's this kind of black box in policy and programs that we have to open up and really explore and own and say, are we doing all the things that are actually necessary in terms of outputs and activities to get us to the outcomes that we all agree are super important? This is the first place I want to stop and have us jump into some breakout rooms together. So you've all just done a great job identifying some of the hows and the whys of the APS program. What I'd like us to do now is to jump into some breakout rooms and to go through a simple exercise together. Now, let me just remind you what we learned earlier. Start with the outcomes, right? The outcomes are what's going to drive your outputs and activities, right? Start on the right and work your way backwards. So what we're going to do is break into groups of 4 or 5, and I just want you to see if you can get through one box. Now, here's the key. Every box has to tie to the next one, right? In order for data to drive a compelling narrative, the data has to connect across the activities and outputs and outcomes. So let's just assume that in terms of one of the long-term outcomes that I saw come out in the chat that's super helpful here is that we want to make sure that people are aging safely in place. That's a fantastic long-term outcome. Now, what that means in the short run is that their needs have to be met and that they have to be healthy and housed, right? Great. So then when I look back at what that means for outputs, it means that for an APS program, an output should be stably housed individuals, right? Which means that as an activity, when I find out that someone is not stably housed, I should be referring and connecting them to some kind of monetary or housing system that allows for that output to be met, which is a stable house, which allows to that short-term outcome, which is stable housing, which leads to the long-term outcome, right, of aging safely in place. Does that make sense? Y'all follow that logic? You see how I went sort of back to forward there? Good. Thanks, Michael, sorry. Appreciate all the thumbs up. Okay, now, so that was like my cheat sheet. That was a good example, I think, that you all came up with. You guys just did this in the chat. I just linked it together in this particular format. So now we're going to have you guys go into breakout rooms, and I want to see if you can come up with another example. So let's have folks go out into a breakout room 4 or 5 minutes together and see if you can sort of discuss going backwards to forwards together and come back to the group with an example of a long-term, short-term output activity that lines up with your goals in APS. And got some head nods. I saw some people flipping through paper, which always makes me really excited. It meant you were engaged enough that you actually wrote something down. So that's cool. Oh, good. Okay. All right. So I'm going to do this. I want to make sure that we stay within the time. So what I'm going to ask is that if we have one brave group of people who would be willing to talk us through their conversation and walk us through their sort of reverse order, long-term, short-term output activity. And if you're not the group that's being that volunteers, I would love for everyone else to put in the chat sort of that same thing, either direction. We should be able to tell, right, by what it says, which direction you're writing it in, but kind of that connection so that we can all together, and maybe I'll do this, you know, for a post activity, I'll put it all together in one series of logic models, and we can put it out actually for all of you afterwards so that we all benefit from it. So we have one brave group who will volunteer to walk us through their conversation for a couple of minutes.
I will.
Thank you, Michael. And for everyone else, pay attention to Michael, but also let's drop your ideas in the chat too. Cool.
The light's on me.
It's all you.
So the first one was living in place, but we also talked about people staying connected to community. So looking at how can we bridge the digital divide, you know, people who can't afford access to technology, then providing them technology and real base, you know, training them how to use, doesn't have to be fancy and complicated, but just simple, you know, or even voice activated where they can tell it, you know, go to this, open this, so they can stay connected. Support for in-home care for middle class. So those, again, those who are too rich for Medi-Cal and too poor to pay for themselves is a big issue. So some sort of credit or flexible spending. Flexible medical care in the home. Clients who are non-ambulatory, bed-bound, house-bound, really frail, that getting out of the house and getting to a medical appointment is really a struggle. And so having medical provider come into the home, we talked, even if it's, you have like a nurse come in with a tablet to consult with the doctor, and they can run all the vitals and all that kind of stuff, so that the client's able to receive the service, medical care in their home. So again, back to home calls. Respite services for care providers, and as well as educating staff and family members about these services, and that it's okay to need help. I think after COVID, where the commercial said it's okay not to be okay, we now need to talk about it's okay to ask for help, because we're all going to need it. Let's see here. And another thing we talked about was reliable, safe, and accessible transportation for older adults who can get out. And this also includes the rural areas, and not just metropolitan areas.
Great, thanks, Michael, for sharing. So let me try to digest a little bit of that out loud with you here. Really appreciate the conversation your group had, and certainly appreciate you bringing it back here. Thank you. So it sounds like if I were to consolidate, for example, some of what you just said, a lot of great activities listed in there, which lead to a lot of great outputs. And one of the key things we need to be able to do is tie those back to outcomes. So one thing I heard you say that I'll sort of work backwards with you on here is that a piece of long-term sort of aging in place safely and happily is that the short-term outcome needs to be connection, right? So that was one theme I heard you and your group sort of getting to. So a short-term outcome would be meaningful connection, right? That meaningful connection is a critical short-term goal leading to that long-term goal of aging safely and happily in place. So the outputs and activities that you highlighted that would lead to that connection as a broad short-term outcome included things like access to digital technology, right? We know that Kim McCoy-Wade in the Department of Aging has focused on making sure that there's continued funding for Phone a Friend, essentially, right? Connecting people by phone who might be lonely or want to have conversations. So that would be a good activity, right? That if we could demonstrate that that was leading to this output of people actually having those phone call conversations would lead to that outcome, short term, of staying connected and obviously in our logic model, then getting people to happy, healthy aging in place. Another example I heard you mention was transportation. Fantastic idea, right? Again, short-term outcome, same, you know, is staying connected, but the output in this case is how many people are you serving through a transportation services, and then the activity is getting people connected to that transportation service, right? So you can see that those two activities are both good examples of staying connected, and in a constellation of data, that would be a compelling narrative. If I could say, I'm providing these two services as a county, the access to technology and training and transportation, and I can tell you how many people have accessed that service and that they're then staying connected, feeling more connected, reporting connectedness, and then also aging in place, that's a compelling narrative. That's a great way to get those kinds of things funded, right? That's a great set of activities that lead to a short-term outcome and a long-term outcome. So thank you, fantastic. Appreciate you sharing. Questions about what I just said there or how I made those connections in reverse order for anyone on the call here?
We have some folks, groups that have contributed to the chat. So David says, our room came up with keeping clients in their homes by way of IHSS, home safe, and arranging for appropriate case management.
Fantastic. That's a great example. I'm so glad that you mentioned two other services within DSS, right? Again, that data piece, that's my job, is to help connect those pieces and to help you see how many of those folks are connected to IHSS, how many of those people are using our housing and supports through Home Safe. Fantastic examples, good ideas in terms of what I should be thinking of to support you all at the central level, right, up at DSS to get that data out there. You want to read one more, Krista?
Sure. So Pat, our long-term outcome was financial stability that allows someone to age safely in place. The short-term outcome would be basically stop the bleeding and develop a plan to help stabilize the financial situation. Activities in process include financial planning, including possible referrals to fiduciary, addressing adult children who live in the home and are utilizing parents' finances, addressing capacity issues, and increasing people's community connection through programs like senior centers and friendly visitor. In addition, education about scams and community assistance programs can help people save money and reallocate others of areas of their budget.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pat, for sharing. Great set of examples again. So we can think about these things oftentimes in buckets or in kind of constellations, right? A number of activities there that would lead to that short-term outcome that we then know connect to that long-term outcome for us, which is aging safely in place. So thank you, everyone. We'll consolidate some of these ideas and we'll try to put this out to all of you after this call, but appreciate everyone's participation. And with my last, let's see here, 5 minutes, want to do one more quick exercise, and that is thinking about context for this data. So for those of you that attended yesterday's dashboard walkthrough of the SOC 242, that's one of my teams. One of my teams focuses on just data consumption. So that's my group within RAD that made that dashboard for all of you. And one thing I would like to have a conversation with them about, based on what I hear from you today, is what additional contextual information would be helpful for you in interpreting that data, right? Avoid data for the sake of data, give you some other wraparound data that helps you to understand where should I focus my attention? What should I be looking at? What's actually compelling? And so exploring your data in context is the last thing I want to spend 5 minutes chatting about here. And again, I'll go back to a CalWORKs example. So this is a set of maps that I've created with CalWORKs caseload data and poverty data for the state of California. So on the left, you can see child poverty density. So I've taken existing data that tells me something about where we know there's child poverty in the state of California. And on the right side, I've overlaid that. Well, I've combined it with CalWORKs density data. So we call this a reach concept. How much penetration, how much reach is the CalWORKs program getting in the areas of highest need? Now, here's the great news. Right away, visually, you can see there's a good amount of overlap, right? That means we're doing a decent job in a lot of places. Places where there's high child poverty, we have high CalWORKs participation. That's fantastic. Now let's drill down. The next thing I did was look at that by zip code. So I said, okay, generally speaking at the state level, we look like we're doing okay. What if I drill down into a particular county and look at their zip codes? Well, so now what you see on the screen here is an overlay. The light blue bars in this graphic show you how many kids are living in poverty in a particular zip code. And the dark blue part of that bar tells you how many of those families are engaged in CalWORKs today. So what you can see right away is that in counties, in even one county in this case, so in some zip codes, we have great reach, right? That dark blue bar is almost the same size as the light blue bar. But in other zip codes, we have a big gap. And I said, that's not great. We want to make sure we're serving all of those people equitably. What can I understand about those zip codes that might help me get there? So we pull out those zip codes and look at it using American Community Survey data. And it turns out if I just grab two of those zip codes, one that has high participation and one that has lower participation, right away the things that jump out at me that might help me understand why that's the case are that in the zip code where we had lower reach in this case, we have a much higher percentage of non-English speakers who were foreign born and have lower education levels. And so what I can do then is I gave that information back to the county. I said, here's a particular neighborhood where we know there's higher densities of child poverty, but where CalWORKs is not as highly utilized. And we need to figure out what languages those folks are speaking. We need to get targeted messaging out to them that matters and that they can understand from a different education standpoint. And so that's how this contextual information can be very helpful, right? If I had just told that same county what their CalWORKs participation was in those two zip codes, they might have said, well, that looks pretty good. I don't know, that seems reasonable. But the second I put it in the context of child poverty, we can see, there's some work to be done in this particular area. Does that make sense? A lot of heads nodding. And so this is what we did then to set this up for our dashboard in CalWORKs for CalOR. So I took, in many cases, there are variations of this. I'll just quickly show you a couple. So the first was I always wanted to make sure that people were looking at CalWORKs data next to county data. So this is an example of the state of California and then Los Angeles County. And so right away, what you can see here is that county race and ethnicity breakdown in LA has a high percentage of folks who are Hispanic, Latino, medium, maybe white. And then if you look at the CalWORKs participation, what you see is a much higher representation, right, of Hispanic or Latino folks and a lower representation of whites. So that tells me something about how people in that particular area are experiencing poverty and what it looks like to access the program. So helpful right away to start to understand how these things relate. Similarly, we did something similar to what I just showed you for poverty and deep poverty rates, and then we can compare those things to to CalWORKs participation. And then we also looked at something similar for wage progression. So this was trying to understand, are we doing a good and equitable job of serving males and females in terms of getting them into high quality work, right? Are we making sure that females are getting as high quality work males? Are we looking at and exploring the wage gaps potentially and making sure that counties are aware of that and are focusing on that disproportionality? And so we were able to break things down over time in cohorts by gender. So these are the kinds of things that I like to set up when I'm trying to help people to consume data, to put it in context that matters, right? To give you something else in addition to what you're already entering in, so there's a value add to that data. So the last piece I want to just spend 3-4 minutes on here is what context is critical for you. So what would you like to also understand about either how you're delivering your services or what's happening in your county to make that data more meaningful? Now, we don't have time to do another lengthy breakout here, so if you don't mind, let's use the chat function again. But I would love to hear some ideas from you. What's the contextual data you would like to see with your APS data? I'll bake it into your dashboard. I promise you, 2-3 months from now, I'll put it in that data. You'll go to that SOC dashboard online and I'll put the context data there for you. You just tell me what you need. Feel free to jump off of mute if you want to say something out loud or put it in the chat and we'll read it for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely makes sense why people are brewing. Lori says, I would love to see an overlay of APS reports to the availability of Meals on Wheels and transportation.
Nice, yeah.
And Pat says race and ethnicity.
Good, yep, that's one I'm for sure gonna bake in. Thank you.
And let's see, Martha is saying age and poverty rates. Housing types.
Can you say a tiny bit more about housing type? Is that like density of single family homes or condos, or would that be like availability?
Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, it's me. The various living situations, you know, homeowners, like in Alameda County, of course, we have a large homeless population. And I recently found out that the largest population is age 50 and over, which was shocking to me. So yeah, just where people live, is it assisted living, and things of that nature. So that's what
great. Thanks, Sonia. Super helpful.
Let's see, we have Aaron, comparison to county population.
Sure.
Pat is saying unemployment rates in APS cases involving adult children living in the home. We've got Chris, percent of population in county or living with dementia or age breakdown in county over 60.
Yeah,
and Gail is saying household composition.
Great, all great ideas. Keep them coming. We will track this chat for sure. And what I'll do is we'll pull this down and I'll have some conversations with the folks on the call here, in particular from DSS and Kim, and we'll think through which of these and in what order we can get these baked into your dashboard to help give you more information. But fantastic ideas. Really appreciated the level of engagement with all of you today. Thank you for the work that you do. It's super important. And thank you for caring really about the data and the program and understanding that the data and the people are one in this case. Very happy to be here and really just grateful for this team of people. So thank you so much. I'll wrap up there and hand it back to you, Krista. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Natasha before we let Natasha go? I will, Natasha, if you can send me the slides, we'll get them out to folks. And then I will definitely, I saved the chat and I'll pull out these and send them to you and Kim and everyone. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So if
you have questions, sorry, I'll stay on for a second while you're here. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'll let Natasha go back to the budget revise.
Great job.
I don't have a question, but just a comment. I mean, the data presentation was awesome, and I would really love for you to come back, like when we can do this with aging population, and maybe we can slow it down. I mean, there was so much information that went so fast, it's hard to kind of capture it all, but I love data. I don't know how to do it, but I love it.
I love that attitude. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yes, I hear you, Sonia. We're going to do our training needs assessment very soon, and I'm making notes for next fiscal year. So that's an awesome idea. All right, well, let's see. So Natasha, if you go ahead and stop sharing, I will go ahead and start sharing, and we'll switch it on over to great. And keep adding to the chat, folks. I will go ahead and make note of that. So let me share my screen again, and I'm going to hand it on over to Chris O'Leary. And let's see, we got that going. All right. All right. Hopefully you all are seeing my
Your screen.
my screen. Yes.
Yes. All right. So Natasha was awesome hearing all that perspective. I know many of you, and many of you know me. I am definitely the champion of the 242. You may know me for that. I like the data. I am self-described data nerd, but I am not a data or statistical expert. This just comes from, I have an interest in that area, and I have seen it help my program to dig into this. I have been completing the 242 for my program for over 16 years. It was only in the last year that we turned it over to somebody else to actually do the completion of that, but I'm still involved in the data for the 242. Long before I was a manager, I got the opportunity with my then manager to come to a PSOC meeting and make the case that the state should start collecting client and suspected abuser demographic data on our 242. So it was very, it came full circle when I got to be part of the 242, this recent one that we do collect that data, that I had a role in getting that data collection. So that was exciting for me. So all of our counties have to turn in the 242 on a monthly basis. I hope that you're involved in that process somehow, reviewing that data regularly and asking questions about the data. Does it make sense? Are you seeing changes? Are there oddities? Is really important. One of the things that we do in my county is put the monthly data into an Excel spreadsheet so we can see month by month what's happening in our county. That also helps us look for, is something changing? Is there something that looks odd when you see it in perspective of all the months together? We look at that. Make sure that whoever's completing your data is asking questions and understands the data and brings to your attention, hey, this looked a little different this month, or I'm noticing we're not having as many numbers in here. Is that something we need to talk to the staff about completing? What's the change? CDSS also, when you turn in your 242, if one of your numbers changes month to month by a certain percentage, they're going to alert you to that also. Our person that's doing our data in San Diego is Carl, and this month was the first month he got one of those emails from the state saying, hey, some of your data pieces changed by a good percentage. What's going on? And he was immediately offended. He said, Chris, I triple checked that data. It's correct. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at it. So we looked at it, and of course he quadruple checked his data, and it was correct. But what we looked at was a couple of the areas that had changed in our county, and all of Southern is working on doing consistency and findings data training. And so it just already in that short period of time, there was a change in our data. We were going to look at this at 6 months and a year, but the state caught it first, that there's already a change in how our findings are being laid out because all of our staff have gone through this training. We've had in the last 2 months a big jump in referrals and cases in our county. And so that number did change by a good percentage, unfortunately went higher. And we went back to doing mostly face-to-face cases. So those cases are closing. So of course our face-to-face numbers would have changed. So there's a good explanation when we got curious about the data. It wasn't that the data was inaccurate that he had turned in, but we were able to provide an explanation and look at that data. And showing your data kind of a month to month on a chart can help you start to see some of those patterns too. So make sure your data makes sense and that you're involved with it with your 242. Next slide. Make sure that you understand what's needed for the 242. There's instructions for the 242, and there's FAQs, which I think was a great addition with this recent 242 that kind of asks questions that a lot of people might ask after you read the instructions. But what about, how do I know? What's the nuance of some of those data elements? Make sure you've read through that and that you understand it. Make sure that your line staff and your supervisors understand what data you're trying to collect. Very exciting. We have the new 242 eLearning that's really geared towards your supervisor and line staff of on their level, understanding why the 242 is important, why collecting that data is important, the consistency in what you answer. In San Diego, we're having all of our staff take that training. It's now required by the end of August that everyone's taken it. We've already seen that people have taken it, have come back and said, hey, it said something about this field and I don't understand where in our system is that field, and we're able to show them how we map out where that data comes from, because we're all using different data systems. So make sure that your staff have clear guidance. One of the things we've done in San Diego is, there's a little picture of part of it on here on the slide, is we've made guides for our staff that show them what the field is in our system, which we call Alex. What are the choices for that field, like what goes into that data, and then how do you answer that question? It gives them more detail, because many of you know in our data systems you get a short, you can say like 2 words for what the field is. It doesn't give them the full context of what are you going for here? What are you trying to do? And so these guides help staff understand, how am I supposed to answer that question in order to best complete the data for the 242? And you can use, developing these guides can help you have the conversation when your staff maybe take the 242 training of, this is how we do things. And then help your, let your system help your staff too. Having your system have fields that are required so that you can't move on or you can't submit for closing until certain fields are completed helps. We have learned that over the years, that when we made all the questions that feed our 242 required in order to submit the case for closing, that they're completed. Now, that doesn't mean they're completed accurately. That means that they got completed. It still requires a supervisor to kind of review and make sure the data they said makes sense, that they're not just checking boxes to move it forward, but that is a step towards helping make the system support you, make it required to do that. Okay. And then help your staff understand where the data comes from. Another thing, just an example, in San Diego, we have far more race categories in our system than the 242 asks for. So we have a guide that shows how those are mapped to the 242. So we ask our staff and our call center to ask far more questions about race, but then it maps to the tighter categories on the 242. Same thing with referral sources. We kind of want to know in a little more detail where some of our reports come from than the 242 wants to know. And so we have a map for how those go into completing the 242. And I imagine a lot of your systems have different words and different choices that all you've had to map. And if you don't know that, then go find out how does your 242 look compared to your data system? Where does the data come from? Make sure you're understanding all that. Okay, next slide.
Sure, and we had a question, either Kim
Okay.
or Chris. So who is providing the new 242 training? This is Diana.
Yeah, so that training got provided yesterday, and it was recorded, and the recording is going to be sent out. So we'll make sure at the PSOC level, and maybe even through this training group, that we can send out the link to that recording so that you can see the dashboard and a little bit more how to use it. Oh, and so maybe I was mistaken. Just make sure that clarification. If you're asking about the e-learning about the 242, that's provided through APS WI, and that was the training that was the pre-work for this course. So maybe you took it or you haven't got to it yet, but that also is something that your staff can take as well. So depending on not sure which question was being asked there.
That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you.
It's the 242 and you.
Yes.
Just some ideas of how you can use the 242 data to improve your APS program in your county. Some things that we looked at in San Diego. So in the 242, there's a line about unable to complete investigation. So that's just a total of all the cases where you weren't able to complete the investigation with the finding. So in San Diego, we have more distinct categories for unable to complete investigation. 2 of those are unable to locate the client or client refuse services. And that's the kind of refuse services where you never even saw the client. They wouldn't open the door to you, or you left your card at the door and they called you and said, go away. So you weren't able to get to them. So we looked at that data to see, does it does it make sense? Do we have too many of those cases? Do we have too little? We really don't know. So we looked at the data by our workers, and then we looked for the outliers, those that really had a lot of unable to locate or refuse services, and those that had very little unable to locate or refuse services. And for those outliers, we kind of dug in, like, what's going on? So one example is we found a worker who literally almost never, for the period we looked at, had any unable to locates. So that was kind of amazing, because we definitely had an average of our workers that was well above that, because it makes sense. Sometimes we're not going to find our clients. So we looked at that worker, and that worker is actually on this training because now she is a supervisor in my program, a very valued supervisor. We kind of looked at her and her cases and built best practices out of what is she doing that she has such a success in finding her clients. That's Amy Wazak. So from out of that, that was really helpful to us to see. We built some practices, like she had some skills that we could apply to other cases to have better success in locating our clients. And now we have that best practice in with our policy, so we can help workers be more successful at finding their cases. We had another worker that had so many unable to locates that we immediately thought, we have a personnel problem. This worker is just saying can't find the client and not really doing the work. That was kind of our immediate thought. But then when we dug into her cases too, we found out she's assigned to an area that is kind of in our downtown that's almost all either shelters, transient housing, SROs. So as we looked at her cases and really went through, it kind of started to make sense. Like, she's in an area where actually it really is hard to find your clients sometimes, tracking them down. They don't stay in the same location. So, you know, our first guess that we had a personnel problem actually wasn't what was going on. It was that she really was assigned an area. So be curious about your data. Don't make assumptions about what it means. Like, look into it. And then with the refused services, we also had some that didn't get refused very often. So what are they doing different? How are they not getting the refusals, even on those ones that typically would? And out of that, we could look for training opportunities and mentorship to kind of help those staff that get more refused services have better success in engaging our clients to participate with APS. And one area that we're looking at right now, we've actually put it in a measure on our county's aging roadmap, is looking at support services. So this is part in line 32 of the 242. So you'd never expect to have 100% on providing our victims with support services, because sometimes we do our investigation, but actually support's not needed or already put in place. So you would never think you'd have 100%, but looking at that data, you could start to see, makes you evaluate, are there programs that we don't have, or do we not have something that our clients needs? Helps you kind of look into that and see what could we do differently. Do we need to train staff about available resources that they just aren't utilizing that actually could be a benefit to our clients? And then we can, this is also a measure that since we're collecting on the state level, we can kind of benchmark against the state. Like, are we in line with what the rest of the state is doing in this area? Are we higher and lower? Why is that? I mean, these are conversations maybe we'll have in the future with PSOC or with others, like how are you getting this number? What are you doing? What are you seeing? So it's the curiosity, like digging into what this 242 data can mean, which I think makes it more exciting that we're collecting things about our clients and our abusers now that can really help us develop our programs. And that we're developing benchmarks, especially with the dashboard now. So next slide. So now we have a data dashboard. I know some on PSOC, some of us have been like so excited to have this, that this is what we've wanted for a long time, is to be able to see the APS data beyond just posting the sum of the 242 on the website, but being able to use it as a tool. And if you didn't take the training yesterday, or you haven't signed up to have access to the data dashboard, I would recommend it. You are able to see your county, compare it to other counties, see California as a whole, and lots of exciting graphs and models that make the data interactive. And it sounds like with Natasha that we'll even get some outside data overlaid on that will even help us further in looking at this. You can download data, you can take the graphs, so it may help your program in advocacy and help you improve your practice. Maybe you're looking at other counties going, hey, they're a much smaller county and they have a much higher success in this, or they get much less of this. Why is that? could we share? Could we talk to each other and see how we could help each other out? You can use the data from the 242 report, the data that's in your system, to make a report, a data report about your county. We produce a report every fiscal year that is kind of the APS data in pictures. Usually about 30 pages, and this has been really helpful for us in advocating for our program, with having this picture that those that don't know APS or maybe understand it can kind of see in nice pictures and easy to read graphs, the need, the breadth of what APS is doing, the holes in APS. We've been able to advocate for staffing and helps for our program that's been very successful over the last few years. Also, having this helps us when others call us and say, hey, can you tell me data about this? I don't know if other counties get that, but we get requests for, can you tell us this data? Can you help us with that? Or we get students doing reports about data that might be interested in being APS workers in the future. This is our kind of our go-to. We can share this with anybody who asks, but it's a great advocacy tool as well. And it can help you highlight your program and showcase what you're doing in your program. So I would encourage you to dig into your data, see what does it mean? Does it look good? Do I understand it? Do I know where my things come from? Do my staff understand why consistency in doing our data correctly is so important for the state level and then that national level? And I do just want to again highlight the new 242 training. I think it does a great job of showcasing why the 242 is important in a language that our staff understand and can get them on board with helping us with accuracy, because the more all of our data gets added together, so the more consistent we are county by county, the better our state data is and the better tool it is for research and funding and all the future endeavors and understanding what the need is for APS. Any questions for me?
Hand claps. Any questions for Chris?
Chris, I have a quick question, and it's kind of maybe a silly question on the Excel. So are you just dropping your 242 into that master Excel spreadsheet, or did you have something set up? Are you having that put in a data entry in? I don't have an analyst, so anything I do, it's me.
Yeah, well, that was me for many, many years until just this last year. So I totally get you. We have a Excel, and so we have 4 tabs to kind of break it up so it's not so long. Kind of the introductory data and then the client, victim, and case data. We kind of do it that way. And yeah, just we kind of highlight, copy, and paste it in to the report each month and then have it total. So kind of once it was set up, it's easy to use. It just, a little bit to get it set up. And I'm happy to send it. You could erase our data and put yours in. It would already be set
I
up.
was just going to ask you if you could send a blank copy. I don't,
Yeah,
as far as
it helps.
I don't mind taking it out.
Yeah, then at the end of the year, it makes it easier to kind of develop the charts and things from your data because it's already collated into a year and you've got the subtotals there. So it's been helpful in being able to more quickly showcase our data.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. Chris, if you want to send that to me, then Rabaz can send it out with a little package, because we'll have the slides from Natasha and all of that. So
okay,
that would be great. Thank you. Lori, you're on mute. You look like you're trying to talk.
Thank you. I would say those of you that are working with a case management system, once you have a copy of that report, you could go to your case management person and say, can you replicate this for me? It would make it so much easier if I had this. Because since it's just a matter of dropping the data into a shell, they can program that really easily, I would think.
Yeah, and just because your system might automate your 242, which ours doesn't, don't make that your reason for not getting into your data. Like, you still should make sure that it's always making sense, that it's accurate, that all of that. I think that's one of the benefits of ours not being automated, is it makes us intimately aware of our data, but it's still possible even if you have a system that happily just produces it for you.
Good point. Good point. So with that, we're going to go ahead and break you into groups. Now, so we did send out, we did register you all for that new SOC 242 eLearning, the SOC 242 NU, what you need to know. And it's okay if you have not gotten to it or not finished it yet. Highly recommend that you do, especially before the booster. But we're going to go ahead and break you into groups. One of the things that we ask you to contemplate while taking the e-learning is, you know, with the data form, the FAQs, how can your county improve consistency in staff recording this data? How might you use this data in your program? And how will you do this? So thinking about just picking one data element, how can your county improve consistency? How might you use the data in your program, and how will you do this? So we're going to go ahead and break you into groups. Actually, Rabaz, can we go ahead and do 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and do some processing and talk about next steps for the booster, which will be a continuation of the conversation.